Hi, everybody. Thank you for your patience as we're just getting everybody in. I think we are just waiting for one more speaker based on technical issues, and we take full responsibility for that. But in the meantime, I would like to just hand over to Reshma, who will do our opening remarks, and we'll get started. Thank you, Reshma.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for being here. It's exciting to see everybody registered for this event and people coming into the lobby, so thanks for your patience. In 2016, resettlement held the world's attention. States made commitments, numbers rose. The New York Declaration promised to match resettlement places to annual need. In 2018, the Global Compact on Refugees called for a 3-year strategy on resettlement. There was momentum. These felt like moments where the system was finally moving in the right direction. Less than a decade later, here we are, watching a systemic retreat from the very tools designed to share responsibility for the world's most at-risk people. 2.5 million refugees are projected to need resettlement in 2026. Yet the United States has cut its quota from 125,000 to 7,500, a historic low. Other states are also pulling back. The gap between needs and political will has never been wider. However, resettlement has survived controversy before. It has risen and fallen from the international agenda more than once, including the inevitable drop during the COVID pandemic. What the historical record also shows us is this: resettlement tends to be reduced to a numbers game when it is anything but. It is a durable solution. It is a life-saving protection tool. It is one of the clearest expressions of what shared international responsibility looks like in practice. The evidence also tells us that 67% of people globally agree that people should be able to take refuge from war and persecution, including in their own countries. Political leaders are cutting quotas, but communities are not abandoning this principle. And that matters, because civil society is where that principle gets translated into action, into integration support, into advocacy, into the local political will that keeps this tool alive when governments step back. Today, we have 4 exceptional speakers who will help us interrogate what this moment demands. This is not a moment for easy answers, but it is exactly the right moment to ask the tough questions. So let me hand over to our moderator, Basma Alawi, Senior Advisor for Policy and Advocacy at Refugee Congress, to get us started.
Thank you so much, Reshma, and welcome everyone. I hope that you are having a great time wherever you are. I wanted just to really reflect on what Reshma shared and what's really stayed with me in her remark. On one hand, we are at a historic high of displacement, 1 in every 67 people forced to flee, and yet access to solution remains incredibly limited. Resettlement, which we know is one of the most predictable and life-saving pathway, is reaching only a small fraction of those who need it. At the same time, we are seeing a retreat in policy and political commitment. But what you reminded us and what we see every day is that the communities have not stepped back. People still believe in protection, in welcoming, and in shared responsibilities. And I think what that tells us that the principle of resettlement hasn't gone anywhere. It's still there, grounded in communities, even when systems pull back. So the real challenge for us now is how we protect that and how we carry it forward in this moment. My name is Basma Alawi. I am based in the US as someone who was forcibly displaced. Resettlement was the answer that made safety and future possible for me and my daughter, who is now a high school senior, with the chance to choose her education and shape her own path. And I'm honored to hold this space with all of you today. I will share some housekeeping and introduce the speakers first. All participants are currently on mute. To avoid background noise, please raise your hand during the question and answers discussion, and we will enable your microphone and camera. We would like to encourage your engagement and interaction during today's discussion. Please use the chat to share comments, reflection, or questions throughout. Our team will be monitoring and grouping those questions. We will have dedicated Q&A section at the end where we will bring in as many of your questions as possible. So please, during that time, feel free to raise your hand for direct intervention or question. And if you experience any technical issue, try to rejoining the call or let us know in the chat and we will do our best to assist. Kindly note that this session is being recorded. We have also been very intentional in how we have structured this session to make sure we hear from all of you. We will start with about 20 minutes of direct questions from me to each speaker. Then we move into a more open conversational dialogue with a few prompts. After that, we will open it up to hear from all of you. When you ask a question, feel free to direct it to a specific speaker or note if that's really for the full panel. Now, I would like to introduce the phenomenal speakers we have today, starting with Sasha Chanov, the founder and chief executive officer for Refuge Point, Jackie Keegan, deputy director, Division of International Protection and Solution at the UNHCR, Mustafa Ailo, managing director at RSEAT, and David Herrero Gomes, head of resettlement and other special program, Ministry of Inclusion, Social Security and Migration, Government of Spain. So I want to start actually the conversation with Jackie to ground us on the why. Why is resettlement so critical to the international refugee protection regime, and how has it evolved over time? To you, Jackie.
Thank you very much, Basma, and thank you for putting this together. And goodness gracious, we've got nearly 100 people in the room. So I'm hereby looking at 95 advocates and potential advocates if you're not already. So thank you very much for joining the fight. So, I mean, at first, resettlement, what is it? Why is it? If you're here, you have a sense. But I think, at its very most basic, resettlement offers a new life in a new country. It ensures protection against refoulement from day one, that is, protection against forced return to danger, and an opportunity eventually to apply for citizenship and build a new life, right? Resettlement, at its most simple, is a new life for people who need it. Of course, it's a lot more complicated than that. And over time, resettlement went from the 1 million people who were resettled by UNHCR's predecessor from Europe to 37 countries around the world after World War II, right? 1 million people to 37 countries. Those countries retained that link to this project. When we got to the 1956 Hungarian crisis, 80% of the people who fled Hungary in 1956 were resettled within a year and a bit, we'll call it 2 years, to, again, those same 37 countries. So we're looking at 75 years of a global project to do a whole bunch of different things, including save lives. At the very most basic, resettlement saves lives. There are people who are alive today who would not have been alive had they not been given the opportunity to leave the country that they had found asylum in, they had found protection, but they needed help that went beyond the capacity of that resettlement country, and therefore resettlement saved their life and certainly improved the life of their family. 2, an answer to a durable solution, a true durable solution, a future where protection is needed, yes, but also where there are no other solutions available, where going home is not going to happen anytime soon, and where people, if we've done our homework properly, people are the people who really most need to have a future that is clear today. 3, and this cannot be overstated, and I think that Sasha will probably end up talking to this as well, resettlement breaks the cycle of displacement for the next generation. So resettlement pays for the people, for the refugees themselves. Resettlement pays not only for the individual who is selected for their family, but also for the generations to come. High school students in Florida, for example. For communities, And this is both refugee communities and the hosting communities, both in countries of asylum and in countries where they eventually settle. It's an invitation to contribute to and integrate into a new community, a new country, and to shape your country differently in a positive way. It secures protection benefits for those who remain. We have many examples of where resettlement has, even in small numbers, helped countries to justify the public contract, the social contract of keeping borders open. We have maintained asylum space for non-traveling refugees because of resettlement. When we're talking about resettlement plus complementary pathways, of course, it also provides safe and safe alternatives to irregular movement. And I think we shouldn't forget that there's the other side of the coin, right? We're talking about resettlement today, but there's certainly more. There's no question that well thought out resettlement lifts stress from development interventions in host countries. So if we're trying to build up the services that are available in a hosting community, and we take the people who have most need of those services and we get them to a new home, then there's more beds open in the hospitals, there's more schools available, etc., where we're relieving stress in a way that then makes life better, again, not just for refugees, but also for their hosts. And it can contribute strategically to countrywide strategies. We've had hundreds of thousands of people find nationality, find local solutions, in part because resettlement has been available. And then very quickly on the third level, at the country level, so people level, refugee level, community level, and at the country level, it is an expression of solidarity with countries of asylum that continues to resonate. This week, I heard from the largest refugee hosting country about how exactly they could get more resettlement places. It matters even in small numbers. Deepens relationships between states. There's no question that if we're looking at multilateral diplomacy, resettlement is a very concrete way of states committing to really being a partner in what countries are going through around the world. It can contribute to regional stability, including via those partnerships that maybe go beyond resettlement, but also, again, make sure that we're maintaining the stresses and thinking about what we can do to relieve them. It reinforces states' credibility as principled international actors, which gives them then more voice in other conversations. And it connects international commitments with domestic priorities. And that then brings us right back to individuals and to communities. It's an opportunity for us to express deliberately where we are as a country and how we're contributing to the rest of the world. Over.
Thank you so much, Jackie, on sharing the why and grounding us in this moment, but also sharing the why of the impact of resettlement, not just on refugees, but communities and countries as well. I wanted actually to go to Sasha now, and really would love to hear from Refuge Point perspective, has always and often emphasized the needs to preserve the humanitarian nature of resettlement. So would love to hear from you, Sasha. What does this mean and why it's so relevant now?
Thanks, Basma. It's great to see you here. And congratulations on all your incredible work with the Community Sponsorship Hub. And Jackie, great to be with you here. You and I have been doing this together for, 25 years? We probably even shouldn't mention how long when we met in Nairobi many years ago. Mustafa, great to see you as well. And to everybody here, welcome. Refuge Point is one of the organizations that collaborates closely with UNHCR on the front end, identifying refugees for resettlement around the world. Other organizations play that role as well. International Catholic Migration Commission, until recently Danish Refugee Council. I'll mention also HIAS and IRAP, which have played an important role on the identification side as well. But I wanted to go back first to something that Rashma said, and we're grateful to ICVA for organizing this event, about the life-saving nature of resettlement, and that Jackie emphasized. That is certainly the case. It's not theoretical, it's present, it's real right now. I remember a number of years ago when I was starting Refuge Point, there was a horrific massacre in Burundi called the Gatumba Camp Massacre. There was a little girl in that camp. She was 10 years old. Her name is Sandra. And the killers came into her tent. They killed family members around her. She's talked about this very openly and publicly. Her younger sister was killed. She miraculously survived. She had a chance to resettle to the US along with her surviving family members. She came here, rebuilt her life. I actually realized as I was thinking about this that I have a picture of her right here because she's become an author and a speaker and an advocate for refugee girls and women around the world. I share this story because there are many people, as Sandra just told me recently, who are in the exact same kinds of situations like her. People who are in life-threatening jeopardy right now. Resettlement is the only legal migration pathway that starts with the needs of people like Sandra, identifying people who are in life-threatening jeopardy and might not survive if resettlement. There are a lot of other legal migration pathways that are growing and gaining prominence, and they're so important, from labor mobility to education opportunities to community sponsorship. But all of these actually, somebody in the receiving country, an individual or an entity saying, I'm interested, a company might be interested in somebody, or a university wants to offer a scholarship. None of these pathways except humanitarian resettlement start with the needs of someone like Sandra. So it's critically important to maintain this and to build this. And yet we're seeing that in many cases, as we heard, governments are reducing their resettlement programs, are shutting them down. And for all of us who've been doing this work, and I know so many of you who are listening are doing this work on the receiving end or on the identification end, or are refugees yourselves who are hoping for resettlement, this is critical. It's urgent. It's not theoretical. And we have to find the most effective ways to advocate with governments so that they can continue and expand these programs in a way that matches community needs and their interests.
Thank you so much, Sasha, for grounding us in the human story, and really uplifting that, and really affirming that resettlement is a life-saving program, which that's my next question to Mustafa. So as we have heard the stories from Sasha and the why from Jackie, it's clear resettlement saves lives. Has this message been lost, and how can we shift the lens around it?
Thank you, Basma, and thank you, everyone. And hi, Sasha and Jackie and Basma. Looking forward to see you next week in New York. I do not think the message that resettlement saves lives has been lost among refugees. I mean, family, caseworkers, community that have welcomed resettled refugees. Many people in this room in particular, I mean, exactly know what the resettlement and what does that mean. It can mean, I mean, Sasha also mentioned like a beautiful story. It can mean a woman facing severe violence is moved to safety. It can mean a human rights defenders no longer has to hide, and it can mean child with urgent medical needs gets a future, and it can mean a family that is not forced onto a dangerous route to be resettled, and something that I lived myself, and being reunited with my family back in Canada at one point when I was separated from them for over like 8 years. What I think the message has been lost is in the political spaces. So maybe also in the public memory, that's where the message has lost. Resettlement has been reduced to quotas, ceilings, targets, and domestic pressures. Numbers obviously matter, of course. But when we speak about numbers, we risk forgetting what the numbers represent. A resettlement places is not an administrative category. It is often difference between protection and refoulement, between safety and detention, and between literally life and death. So I think we need to shift the lens in 4 ways, all of us, and especially mostly to the audience and this group. First, we need to think of resettlement and transition it from charity to protection. I think Jackie also was talking a little bit about this, that resettlement is not a generous favor by states. It's a part of the international protection system. It's a durable solution and protection tool and a form of responsibility sharing. If we treat this as an optional charity, it will always be the first things to cut when policies become difficult. Second, from numbers to risk, everyone here knows that around 2.5, we've listened to numbers that projected 2.5 million refugees are projected in need of resettlement in 2026. But maybe we need to say those numbers a little bit differently. That even if the world meets the 2026 goal of 120,000 refugees resettled, then unfortunately, I don't think that the world will meet it. But let's say that even if the world meet that number, then we're talking about that 1 out of every 21 people in need of resettlement that basically get access to that solution. And this is even when it was the highest in 2024, that it was only 1, and that was a record high. It was only 1 out of 13 people that actually were able to access resettlement, and even though they identified that need of resettlement. So we are becoming very good at identifying needs, I feel, as a community, but increasingly bad at converting those needs into a safety. Third, we need to move from short political memory to historical memory. The refugee protection system was not created because of displacement was happening somewhere far away from other people. It was created because mass displacement was happening in Europe. And many people forgot that countries we now associate with displacement, including Syria, Egypt, and Palestine, once hosted European refugees during the Second World War II. In 1944, MERA, the Middle East Relief and Refugee Administration, was actually overseeing more than 40,000 refugees, mostly women and children, in camps across Middle East and North America and North Africa. That history matters. It reminds us that refugee protection is not a gift from stable countries to unstable countries. It's a system built because societies can become unsafe and any people can need refuge. The direction of flight changes. The responsibility should not. Fourth is basically we need to connect resettlement to the wider protection system. Family reunification, labor mobility pathway, education pathway, and sponsorship are all important, but they cannot replace resettlement. A person facing imminent protection risk cannot always wait for a job offer, scholarship, or a family link. Complementary pathways should expand the protection ecosystem, but not become a polite excuse to shrink resettlement. So what I want to end is like when resettlement places are cut, the risk does not disappear. It is transferred to refugees, to host communities, to families, to frontline NGOs, and often to dangerous route. And I think we need to keep this always in our mind.
I'm trying to find my clapping emoji, but I can't find it on the chat, so I'm just doing that.
Thank you so much, Mustafa. Really, really appreciate all of the learning that we get to have here in this space. And I also want to uplift that we will touch on some of the points Mustafa shared around complementary pathway and how not to replace resettlement, but to be really complementary to the resettlement. I wanted to also uplift that it seems like David, the head of resettlement and other special programs from the Ministry of Spain, is still having technical issue and not being able to join, but I still want to continue this conversation despite that, and really move into more a dialogue between the three speakers we have here. So I wanted to open it up a bit. I would love for this part to feel more conversational. So all speakers feel free to unmute and really join the conversation. Because what I am hearing and what we're really talking about here is how resettlement holds and evolve in this moment. We have perspective here from UN, civil society, and lived experience. So the question is, how do these pieces actually come together to sustain and grow resettlement today? So maybe Jackie, I would love to hear from your experience, what actually makes system welcoming, what makes a system welcoming and sustainable? And I would love to hear from others to react. How do a strong integration system translate into a stronger public and political support?
Okay, so I'm not the expert here. I'm watching with delight what countries like Spain are doing, and I wouldn't want to upstage them. So I think we probably should turn this back to the audience and ask them what they have found to be useful. I will give some roll the ball down the hill starting ideas. One, there's no question, it has to do with a welcoming society. It has to do with communities that are willing and in fact eager to include people in their daily lives. And I think, you know, we see that in Brazil, right? We see one of the countries that is working on building up its sponsorship work in communities to support people who have been referred for protection reasons. We know that sponsorship is really important when you're talking about bringing family members or members of your faith community or, you know, others you might have a connection to. But the welcome that is offered through the Australian CRISP program, through some of the different programs in Canada, all sorts of different parts of the world where communities are not only welcoming in a cultural sense and inviting people into their homes for an odd meal, but actually really part of the backbone of funding the integration process that it takes for people to settle in a new country, right, before they get a job. So that's one area, and there's no question that that's the most important. And building on that then is, of course, political will. If the politicians are skeptical, or if they're not engaging with the communities about what it would take for this to work, then we have less space ultimately for new people to come, because those first weeks and months are complicated. I don't think we should underestimate the fact that it does cost. People arrive in a cold place. They don't have a coat. They don't know how to rent an apartment. They don't have, in North America, there's a whole thing about credit rating, right? You don't have a credit rating, you can't get an apartment. There are papers that you have to get. Their kids have to figure out where they land in school. There are all sorts of things that take time. So before refugees go on to being the productive people that we know they are, and Sasha will give you statistics on this, I think, you know, what we definitely need to make sure is that there's enough cash for them to have a cushion, whether that comes from the community, whether that comes from government, whether that comes from NGOs, wherever it might come, essentially depending on the way that particular country is set up. There does need to be a bit of investment there. What we know, though, is that refugees around the world are much more likely than migrants otherwise. And I say this as a migrant, so, you know, I acknowledge our weaknesses in my particular group of people. Refugees are much more likely to take up citizenship and do so quickly. They're much more likely to, if they have a business, to hire other people to build into their society. They're much more loyal employees than people who come on other migrant pathways and so on. So, come on migrant pathways. So I just that openness to the time that it takes for people to find their feet is very much repaid multiple times. But we do need to be creative and think about the way that our societies work so that we are best able to welcome people and give them the space they need to flourish. Again, everybody else on this panel knows more about this than I do, so I look forward to hearing what others have to say.
Well, I think I'd love to jump in. Is that okay? Or Mustafa, did you want to add something? I'll jump in. Thanks, Jackie. I wanted to put some more context to what you said and go back to Basma, your really important question around how do we translate the interest of civil society and people in creating welcoming societies into action and political will. That's such a key. You see that does happen in a lot of places in a lot of different ways, or at least there is a groundswell of opportunity. Basma, again, you were a leader at the Community Sponsorship Hub, creating opportunities in the US for refugees to come and integrate into communities through sponsor groups that raised their hand and said, I want to bring somebody in. We're seeing a growing swell of that just in the US alone. And I wish politicians in the US would understand this more thoroughly. Over 2 million people in all 50 states and 12,000 zip codes raised their hand over the past few years and said, I want to welcome an Afghan family. I want to welcome a Ukrainian family. I want to welcome a refugee family from around the world. These have to be pragmatically done, obviously. You can't bring in too many people that a community doesn't have the capacity to integrate, but many communities have a great deal of capacity. They have interest, they have will, they have opportunity. In fact, as Jackie said, communities see that refugees who arrive are tremendously beneficial. I've written op-eds about how refugees contribute to the economic vitality of cities and communities where they land. They're entrepreneurial, they start businesses, they pay taxes. One US government study showed that they pay $64 billion more in taxes than they receive in services over a decade. There are many statistics like this, but you see this over and over again. You see it in Canada, you see it in many other countries. So, and you see a groundswell of support. So we have to figure out ways to translate that groundswell of support into political will, because I do think there's a lot of politics at play now, and the fact that so many countries have completely shuttered their resettlement programs, and as Spain is a shining exception of that, being a moral leader as a government, raising the flag and saying resettlement is valuable and important to us. But if communities and civil society could figure out how to translate the will that's there, that's an undercurrent in the countries where we live, into political action, we could try to increase resettlement, and we need to.
Thank you, Sasha. Jump in, Mustafa.
I think the only two comments I wanted to add, also kind of on Spain, and it's good also to mention that not only Spain is showing this kind of a leadership at a certain time, it's showing actually this at the time where Spain is economically the fastest growing economy in Europe in a way. which kind of somehow also, I just want to take it from a practical perspective, that it is recognizing, it's part of it that, you know, they need this kind of a people, and they need this kind of a contributions that's happened. And maybe this is one of the ways that we need to shift also our long-term, let's say, kind of a process of advocacy when it comes to resettlement. But often and historically has always been with the civil society, and I'm talking so much about civil society because I feel like most of the audience today from civil society is that has often working only with either, you know, the clients, the refugees, and others, and the policymakers. But maybe what we've learned recently from the political shift, that maybe we need to think a little bit more and beyond this. Like, is there a way that we can start working with the public opinion, that with people in the community, and then how can we basically start having this? One of the interesting things in Canada is always, you know, I was always asking myself when it came to Canada, why Canada among, even though unfortunately right now, even Canada is cutting some of the resources, but still, like, Canada continue to be one of the most welcoming countries on both of the aisles from the political party, whether basically conservative or liberal in that sense. And there was an interesting survey that I've read a few years back. It was done by McGill and UFT. In that survey, it was very fascinating fact that 1 out of 8 Canadian was basically directly or indirectly involved in supporting refugees. That number struck me because Canada started basically doing private sponsorship in 1979. Australia was the first after Canada in 2015. So Canada was like 30 years ahead of Australia at that point. And today you talk to Canadian, they don't think of resettlement or private sponsorship. They don't think of it as a complementary pathway. They think of it as like part of the, like, this is a Canadian thing. That's part of the community. That's something that, you know, we someone in the family got involved into it. So maybe this is a way that we need to build, we need to have a little bit more of a long-term thinking in that sense. So to think of like a plan that continues and maybe take our losses for the next 5 to 10 years. I don't know, hopefully it doesn't last that much. But start kind of a rebuilding with that community, rebuilding through the complementary pathway, rebuilding through maybe kind of a shifting the narrative, rebuilding through talking about how at the end there are countries who are aging and are in needs of people, and then they're losing, like, municipalities and small cities are vanishing. Then how can we basically utilize the idea of welcoming refugees, but at the same time utilizing this? And maybe we need to do more numbers. Sasha, by the way, the $64 billion, there is an updated study that actually even now talk about over $120 billion more than what they took in taxes on this. There was a study in Canada, in Vancouver City, that 2,500 Syrian refugees based on the boat people. So 1979, that in 20 years, they would be adding over $500 million in profit to the city itself in a way, only with 2,500. So maybe those kind of the message that the civil society, we need to reshift. We need maybe kind of to span a little bit out of our comfort zone, which is the clients and the policymakers, but also talk to the people.
I love all of the numbers I am hearing, and really how we can make sure those messages are resonating with the governments to really create the political will in the end of the day to welcoming. I have 2 more prompts that I would love to go further with, and much of it is started already is around complementary pathway, since we have been already bringing it up in multiple questions and answers. But in the meantime, I want to ask people to continue to put questions and interventions in the chat, and we will get to there after those 2 prompts of conversations. The first one is, Sasha, your work really spans resettlement and other pathways. Family reunification, Refuge Point has been known of its leadership on family reunification, labor pathway, and we have heard that over and over. How do we expand those creative and innovative pathways without weakening the resettlement itself? And maybe for Mustafa and Jackie, feel free to come in. What does that right balance look like right now? You heard the numbers from Sasha. 2 million people have stepped in when pathways for complementary pathway opens in the US in the past years. I mean, I became sponsor myself here in Jacksonville with 20 other community members who are all now knowing how to really support and understand resettlement so much better. And I think one of the things that I have seen out of those 20, couple went and supported the local resettlement agency after they lost funding and caseworkers were really lost jobs. So I have seen how complementary pathway bringing new allies and new communities that really support the resettlement in the end of the day. So Sasha, would love to hear from you and also open it to Mustafa and Jackie if they want to chime in.
Thanks, Basma. I'm so glad you highlighted that you're a sponsor. I am too. And I think we're speaking to the choir here, actually. And if there are people here who are just learning about resettlement for the first time and are curious about this, sponsorship or supporting a refugee directly is an inspirational thing and can be absolutely life-changing, because when you see that you can play some small role in helping somebody to rebuild, it is sometimes a hugely gratifying thing. I know that personally in my family when my mom and dad started supporting a group called the Sudanese Lost Boys and Girls, and my siblings and I then looked at each other a year later and said, they don't even remember who we are. But it changed their lives, and that was 25 years ago when that group that they supported started coming in. I wanted to bring us back up to an important point that I think Jackie and others touched on, which is that we see growing displacement today. Over 120 million people have fled their homes, and about 1/3 of those are refugees. That is, they've crossed into a neighboring country. Wars are not ending quickly. I was just on a call a few days ago with a new High Commissioner for Refugees who highlighted the long-term nature of displacement. Some people are refugees for 5, 10, 20 years, or even for generations. So the world, we all, and every country needs to think about durable solutions, lasting solutions, opportunities for people to go home or to integrate into the countries to which they fled, or to move to another country where they can build new lives. Those are traditionally the 3 durable or lasting solutions, but they are really unattainable for most people. Resettlement has often been the most predictable of these solutions. Over 3 million people, many more than 3 million over the past decades, have accessed resettlement and have become citizens in new countries. So there's an exciting opportunity today and over the past few years to build complementary pathways, that is complementary to resettlement, other legal migration pathways where people can move. Labor mobility, as we highlighted, is one of those. I'll mention that the organization Talent Beyond Boundaries is one of the leaders in this labor mobility space. Refuge Point and many others engage in this space as well. And we're seeing a lot of positivity, a lot of opportunities to identify refugees in countries where they're stuck and match their skills with companies in Canada, in Belgium, in Germany, in Ireland, in the UK, in Australia, and other places, to companies that need them and can't find employees locally or nationally. So this is an exciting opportunity. There are also other opportunities to expand legal migration pathways. Refuge Point co-hosts the Global Family Reunification Network, or the FRUN, which has hundreds of organizations and governments and civil society partners looking to facilitate family reunion. And that is key and critical as well. And these also contribute to lasting solutions when a child can reunite with her mother in a country, or when a family is reunited. That's a key to stability of that family in that country. Because of course, if you're separated from your children, the thing you wake up thinking about every day and every second of your day is, how is your child doing and can you reunite with them? So it's key that we continue to maintain and build family reunion, labor mobility, education, which provides these incredible opportunities for refugees to come and become leaders through education, and we see that over and over again. So these are all critical, and Refuge Point is dedicated to expanding them. We work closely with UNHCR. We've had staff now in 89 countries. We've helped about 188,000 people move to other countries or access resettlement and other legal migration pathways to other countries in close collaboration with UNHCR and many other partners who are here. And so I say all that to essentially emphasize that these complementary pathways are key and critical, and people who are listening here who are part of those, please keep up your energy and your motivation toward those. But at the same time, we have to maintain the primacy of resettlement as a life-saving solution.
And a little bit of a call to arms there from Sasha. I think Mustafa said it, Sasha said it, I said it, and I know that it's not news to you. We do have to start. Complementary is complementary to what? Complementary to onshore asylum and complementary to resettlement. There's no question whatsoever that the system needs to think about the people who have the most need at that moment. But I'm going to flip that around a little bit. Think about your community. Your community has people who contribute and who draw from what the community has to offer in different ways. The same person is going to need help this week and be able to offer support to somebody else next week. Refugees are no different. There's no question at all that every refugee community in the world has people who today need something really urgently, might need, in fact, resettlement, might need to be somewhere else, but also have people who are chomping at the bit to finish their education and go and build some extraordinary thing on the other side of the world, and who are stuck by administration, stuck by, maybe the visa's even waiting for them, but they can't get the right passport photo. The barriers to people to be able to take up opportunities are as many as there are humans in the world. And we're trying really hard. And with the people that Sasha mentioned, with Fragman, the law firm that works with TBB, with, as many different partners as we can find to identify ways of lifting barriers. We're working very hard on giving refugees or getting refugees access to travel documents that are machine readable, that are renewable, that allow them to stay for the term of their work visa, that make sure that they can go back to the country of asylum, which means then that they're not so scary to give a visa to the first time, right? So all of the things that get in the way of refugees being able to create their own futures are the things that we need to work on. And I think one of the things we can ask this group, this very large group of people, is, can you think about what you have to bring to this story? Are you able to, my mother is working right now with some people from her church. They have empty houses because the Catholic Church doesn't have as many religious anymore. Of course, the blinds are going to make noise. Can they get those houses, make those houses available to large families who can then, if they've been referred by UNHCR, who can then land in the country I'm from, and settle where, otherwise 2-bedroom apartments are the norm, and therefore countries are nervous about taking large families. I don't have to tell you that this is something that is a block, but we need to think about, what can you do? What can your community do? What can your network do to either make resettlement more feasible for your country, or to contribute to lifting the barriers to complementary pathways? And a really simple thing, right? If you work in the tech industry, if you work in an industry where we're working on documents and identity, then can you, for example, work with your company on trying to make a connection to the countries that need to expand access to those travel documents? Are we able to bit by bit unpick those barriers, lifting what we have to lift, right? Bringing what we have to lift. And I think the reality is that we've got the list. We know we can share links with you. Look at the Global Refugee Forum website at all of the pledges that have been made around resettlement and complementary pathways. Many of those can be contributed to by communities. And we would love to bring more people on board and to continue to grow that family so that we can. The High Commissioner has twice fled. Our High Commissioner, maybe it's the final thing, right? Our High Commissioner was a refugee twice. He had access himself to a complementary pathway twice. And so what does that mean? Not everybody can take his pathway, but there are pathways for many people, not just third country pathways, but opportunities that maybe open up in the country of asylum when people are able to access the remittance money that comes back from somebody else working abroad for 6 months. And if people are preparing themselves for a future, wherever that future may be, then if, in fact, we can find a way to make peace at home, then home becomes a lot more feasible as well. So, and we're looking at Mustafa, who can tell that story. So I think, if we think about refugees as human beings, as just like your neighbor, just like your sister, just like your cousin, like yourself, then we want to think about all of the things that we can do to contribute to them not being blocked in doing the same things that we do every day. The High Commissioner is trying to reduce the number of people in need of his protection in the next 10 years by 50%. He's not diminishing the expectations of countries when it comes to asylum. He's looking for pathways for people to find a future that is not in stasis. And I think he's right? We're looking for people to be able to live an ordinary life, wherever that may be. We're pretty agnostic about it. It has to include other parts of the world.
Thank you so much, Jackie. And this is actually a great transition to speak about refugee leadership. As we have been celebrating the Higher Commissioner who really has experience in forced displacement and complementary pathway, and how he is really his leadership is really energizing to many of us. So I wanted to really touch point on this with you, Mustafa, and bring you to really talk about a refugee-led organizations work and how what kind of role that they are playing at the moment, and how it's really shaping protection and solution in practice. And maybe we end with Jackie after from UNHCR perspective, how do we carry these lessons forward and advocate for resettlement in this moment? And in the meantime, I will start to look at the chat and take some questions. So please start adding your questions while we hear from Mustafa and Jackie.
No, thank you, Basma, and maybe Sasha and Jackie gave me kind of some good examples, just kind of to mention a little bit also the backstory of the refugee contribution to some of these initiatives they've mentioned. But I think refugee-led organization in general, when it comes to protection and third country solutions, they do contribute. Let me just put them in three concrete categories, let's say. First is on protection. Our laws often sees risk before institutions do. They know who's coming and who's not coming forward and afraid to register, and who does not basically trust the formal system, and who's excluded from documentation, language, disability, gender, sexuality, and legal status. We can see this honestly just happening right now on the ground in Latin America, where organizations like Coalición for Venezuelans, as a coalition of refugee-led organizations that have been able to work and identify people and have to trust the people that usually don't want to go and then register with the formal system. We've seen organizations like Basma and Zaytuna right now on a response between Lebanon and Syria, who they have like their own reports on people who is not coming as part of the formal system and in need of access of basically whether third country solutions or protection in particular. And this is especially important for the third country solution, because people in most need are not always the people most visible to the system. Canada's own resettlement and complementary pathway brief recognize the civil society organization help to identify, for example, refer refugees, including LGBTQI, refugees and human rights, and through the EMPP candidates in people and places and population, UNHCR might not be able to use, like to reach, and this is exactly where our laws can be very critical. Second, our laws contribute to policy development. The Global Compact of Refugees call for expanding third country solutions and refugee participation. I think Sasha mentioned labor mobility pathway, which is something also that I have worked on since it was an idea in 2017 with Talent Beyond Boundaries, and also the name that I always would love people to remember, Nizar Polodian, who's a Syrian refugee in Lebanon, who created the first ever beta version for Talent Beyond Boundaries, or identifying refugee skills. And then it was basically two refugee-led organizations that worked with Talent Beyond Boundaries. It was Jumpstart, the one I co-founded, Refugee Talent in Australia. That's the first ever two partners for Talent Beyond Boundaries, are identifying employers to resettle. And you know what, also interesting? It was at a time that when the Minister of Immigration in Canada was a refugee himself. That Minister Ahmed Hussein at that point, and after that, it was then it was in August the creation of the official pilot in 2018 August, Canada, when they kind of did the AMPP labor mobility pathway. But before that, there was so many, and I was one of the few people that was literally negotiating the labor mobility pathway during the Global Compact for Refugees at that point, and many people were basically against it at this point. So I think that was the work, and again, it wasn't only my work, but my connection with Nizar on the ground in Lebanon with other refugee organizations, all that made this happen, created a case in general. So the contributions of refugee-led in policies has been and continue to be tremendous. I think the third, that our laws help operation the operation aspect of the third country solution. They provide trusted information, support referrals, help people understand the option. Actually, Refuge Point, at one point, I did read something in one of the, where it was kind of a quotation came at Refuge Point that RLOs are well placed, maybe the best place to identify refugees who may be eligible for or in need of third country solution to provide information, support, and referrals. So the role of RLOs is not symbolic. Unfortunately, what I'm going to end with, it's not symbolic, it's evidence, it's on the ground, yet it's not being recognized. I mean, definitely, and this is something has been like just kind of recently hasn't been recognized even in conversations when it comes to policies. Just kind of most recently right now, the CRCP, for example, where, we haven't seen that many RLOs that got invited. There are refugees who are invited, but not under other umbrellas, not under umbrella of RLOs and dealing with RLOs as an institution. And I feel sometimes as long as that dealing with refugee and refugee-led organization as institutional partner, this will continue to be one of the gaps of not building stronger resettlement spaces to the future.
Asma, can I come in to add to what
Please.
Mustafa so eloquently said? Mustafa, wow, you hit on all the important points, and I want to double down on a few things that you just said. One is to highlight to everybody here something that we all know or should know, and that is that RLOs, refugee-led organizations, are often the first responders on the ground. That is, they're in cities, they're in refugee camps. A new person arrives there seeking safety and shelter, and the first thing they meet are sometimes other people from their communities or organizations that are community-based that are right there and supporting them. So as you said, Mustafa, RLOs are often the eyes and ears on the ground that know what to do and know how to do it and know how to support their communities. In every country, there are networks of RLOs. In Kenya alone, there are over 120 refugee-led organizations. Now, there is a lot of lip service to the idea of localization and supporting locally led efforts, but there are a lot of barriers to refugee-led organizations actually gaining the capacity they need to do their work effectively. I'm looking in this conversation for like things to do and points to make and things that we can take away. And one of them, Mustafa, that I think you just highlighted in a number of ways, is the importance of getting resources and support to refugee-led organizations on the ground. Can we, as a community of organizations that have access to funders and people, play a bridge to refugee-led organizations? Refuge Point, in fact, is starting to fund some refugee-led organizations because we see that they have the same goals that we do, but they can accomplish them sometimes more effectively, more quickly, or in their micro communities more quickly than we can. So we're funding them. So one thing is, for anybody who's a funder out there, Hilton Foundation is a great leader in terms of funding refugee-led efforts. You should try to look at how to support locally led refugee efforts, and Refuge Point and other organizations can point you toward those. I would say one other thing in terms of integrating refugees into operational spaces, into diplomacy spaces, into the spaces where decision making happens, is from an NGO perspective, bring more people onto the board. Refuge Point over a number of years has brought more and more refugee leaders onto our board until more than half now are people with lived experience. And talk about durable solutions. One woman, Micheline, who was one of the first people to go to Canada through labor mobility, from Kenya to Canada. She had been a refugee for 25 years. She just texted me a month ago with her citizenship picture. She and her young daughter got citizenship in Canada, and they're integrated. I think they bought a house. They're a shining example of what a refugee can bring once she has opportunity. So let's support refugee-led organizations. I think that's the key point that I wanted to make in this intervention. I did want to come back to something that Jackie said around the High Commissioner's efforts to reduce people in need of support by 50% over the next decade. But Basma, I'll pause there because I don't want to stop the discussion around refugee leaders and refugee-led organizations.
It's all good. It's a conversational space. So I'm wondering Jackie, if you want to chime in on lesson learned. I also will say uplifting, not because I need to, but I feel responsible of, I have been sitting as a refugee advisory to the CRCP and have been really learning a lot. And I know there's a lot of struggle in a moment like now, the funding cut on UNHCR and the last minute countries stepping in to host the CRCP, and how small the CRCP going to be this year, which is really sad to see all of those transitions. And I know as a refugee advisor, we have been doing in partnership with UNHCR and with the co-chairs of the CRCP, a lot of advocacy and a creative way to make sure that refugees' voices really uplifted, not just in the event itself, but really in shaping the agenda. I'm working with a group of leaders on shaping one of the session and making sure that is led by refugees themselves. So as funding cuts happen, as really political will is stepping back, creativity is really a key in making sure that we are communicating well in a time like now to make sure the work that we have built so far is not going to be erased, or we never need to start from scratch. And I really want to uplift and thank you, Sasha, for bringing this example of how you have been finding ways for Refuge Point to be led in the board and the governance board of the organization, in supporting the refugee-led organizations on the ground, and in making sure. I have worked with many of your team members, and they have been really amazing partners and thought partners in shaping every space Refuge Point have created. So giving it to Jackie, and then I will start analyzing the chat and opening it to the audience to ask questions.
And Jackie, I'm just going to jump in and ask you also to tell us, the audience here, what the CRCP stands for and what it is, because we've referred to it many times.
Okay, there are maybe 5 things that you've asked me to do, but I'm going to try and be a bit systematic. So, one, there's a whole lot of stuff in the chat here about refoulement, about the protection asylum story. I think this warrants a whole other conversation. So it's not that I want to dodge the question, but I think what we should think about maybe is speak to ICFA. We'll see if we can partner with ICFA on setting up another conversation around what asylum is, what it looks like, repatriation in complicated circumstances and so on. I think that's a really worthy conversation topic, but I don't want to get us off the rails. So that's that. And I put my hand up. I'm happy to come back. I'm not trying to run away. I'm just trying to channel some things. With regard to refugee engagement, I don't want to get into, I can't say better than what Mustafa and Sasha are saying, except if you ever want Mustafa if you ever needing an advocate for anything, ask Mustafa to do it. He's very good at it, and he's achieving his goals, whether others like it or not. So, we'll get there. But I think, UNHCR, and it's a bit of a lesson for us about, when we're thinking about refugee engagement, there's individual refugees who have working in, many people like you, Basma, who are, refugee advisors for the consultations on resettlement and complementary pathways, which used to be the annual tripartite consultations, but we needed to add the refugees, we needed to add civil society, and so we've expanded beyond the tripartite. So the annual consultations, which actually go over the whole year, there's a set of refugee advisors, and over time, and this is in part thanks to people like Mustafa who were alums of this program, they have really been people who have gone from just having lived experience to really working in the sector. We are lucky to have a group of people who are professionals working in the sector and who come themselves from an environment, from a background that left them resettled or where they took advantage of complementary pathways, and that has taken a whole different level to the board's sort of suggestion of Sasha, right? That we've got people who are bringing their professional connections, their professional experience, the ideas that are drawn out of their daily working lives to the story, while at the same time making use of the fact that they in fact do have lived experience and that they can speak to their own situation. I think that's really rich. The other thing to think about when thinking about refugee engagement is that UNHCR has spent we've dropped, our budget has dropped by, call it a third, somewhere between a third and a half in the last year. But the proportion of partnerships that went to locally led organizations, women-led organizations, refugee-led organizations has gone up. So we are really, we've worked on a number of different ways to try and improve that. We need to really think differently about how we think about our partnerships. One of the issues that we had to overcome was working with non-registered organizations, right? How do we work with actors that are not able, not legally able to take up full projects? How do we find a way to work with groups of people who are nonetheless doing really interesting work? And I think so we have to think a little bit about what the administrative structures are in a given place. There's a message in the chat about the Brazilian Welcome Program, and I really cannot say more how interesting it is to look at a group of people who have very little. They're sharing their very little. And now we tried last year to get a refugee sponsorship fund up and going, and it's a bit challenging. The idea was to pull funding from places that had money and get it to sponsoring groups that had less money so that they would be able to grow resettlement in places, resettlement for people who are identified on the other side of the world as being most in need, so that they would be able to grow their welcome capacity. And that's what's happening in Brazil. There's a guy called Ed Shapiro who's trying to build that version of a crowdsourced fund so that we can help from one side of the world to the other. And I think that international cooperation has to be part of our future. And a couple of other things we can do. One, come together. Have a look at your law and policy. Most of us that engage in policy discussions, it's not that hard, folks. Find somebody in your community who is a board lawyer working on contracts and who wants to help out something good, and unpick what the barriers are to whether it's resettlement or complementary pathways working in your community, in your country, and get involved in discussions where you are. Do that as a group, do that as individuals. Two, think about being creative. If we've got a problem with not having enough housing in a country and that is slowing down our migration, what can we do to perhaps marry up? Are there empty institutions where we could bring in refugees who would be willing to be trained in the construction sector to a large number of people who are able to build housing so that we can then have more housing in order for communities to be able to be more welcoming? Think about what's getting in the way of people coming into your society, and think about how you can match up the different people who are able to contribute to that. Refugees themselves might be part of the solution. So think a little bit about what they might bring. And then the other thing I think is to think about the fact that this is the 75th anniversary of the 1951 Convention. 75 years on, read it. It's an extraordinary document, and it's incredibly relevant today, prescient about the things that we need in order to ensure that people can flee to safety. Inside that process of celebrating the fact that many millions of people's lives have been saved by the 1951 Convention and its application by states and by communities around the world, is that we're trying to encourage a series of dialogues. These will be launched on the 28th, which is the birthday of the convention, 28th of July. We'll be starting a series of dialogues, and the idea is to take, thank you, AI, to be able to gather the input from communities around the world, from civil society organizations around the world, talking about refugee matters, talking about asylum, talking about solutions, thinking about how we can improve things so that we end up next year with a new, and those of you who have been around a while will find this familiar, an updated agenda for protection and solutions. Idea being that we will reignite a little bit this international work that we're trying to do. So watch this space. We will send messages, but we'll also get ICFA to do the same thing. Watch this space and get involved. Organize in your backyard a conversation about the part of asylum and solutions that makes a difference to your lives, that most catches your attention, and give those ideas to not only us, but to others in your community, in your country, etc. I think, it has to work at all levels, and we have to see ourselves as working on this together.
Thank you so much, Jackie. There's so much to learn from the three of you, and I am so privileged to call the three of you friends and mentors that I can count on all the time to ask questions and really get wisdom and learn ongoing. I agree with Jackie on the engagement and to if you see something not working, talk about it, gather community around it, and speak up solutions, and trust me, it will work. That's how I got engaged in this work, background engineering and teaching, nothing to do with what I am doing now, but I saw that there were a lot of rooms and opportunities for change and improvement, even in progressive spaces. And I spoke up and I saw the change right away. And since then, I couldn't be quiet anymore. So I really encourage people to and speak with people, really not necessarily the regular people who understand the system. As much as we really bring new communities, we heard tech, businesses, data, we heard very interesting different communities that we can bring into this work and find way to really impact the system. So I really encourage you to speak with people who not necessarily the ones who you talk about resettlement with them. I remember when I was mobilizing to bring more Americans to welcome refugees, I end up speaking with Ubers every time they take me somewhere. I'm like, do you know about this program? And I remember after a year, one of the Uber drivers end up being in the system. And I remember that story forever. So really talk to everyone about resettlement, because you don't know who's going to end up supporting the work we are doing. And if you don't know what Uber drive is, really the taxi in the US and maybe some other countries. So talking about AI, I was able to analyze a lot of the conversation in the chat, trying to understand the themes coming up in the conversation with AI. Feel free, speakers, to really look, and if there are specific question really speaks to you and you want to answer it, feel free to do so. I wanted just to uplift some themes that I am seeing. One is trust, transparency, and accountability. I am reading in the chat that there are multiple cases of community members stuck in the system without clear information on next steps on their cases, and how can organizations and partners improve transparency and communication so people don't feel lost in the process? What accountability mechanism exists when systems fail them? The other theme I am seeing is on protection and shrinking resettlement at a time when we are seeing violation of core principle. And I know we talked about maybe UNHCR and ICVA coming up with a next webinar or a next conversation on non-refoulement and reduction in resettlement commitment, how we can really bring this conversation to future spaces. What are the most realistic way to protect those most at risk, and where we can refugee-led organization meaningfully influence decisions right now? And the last theme I am seeing is on pathways and real opportunities. We have heard from the speakers about the different creative and innovative pathways that the speakers have been engaged in. We are hearing in the chat that refugees are skilled, ready, and pursuing pathways like labor mobility, but is still facing last-minute breakdown or lack of access. What needs to change to make these pathways more reliable, and how can partnership with refugee-led organizations make them actually work in practice? And I also seen some great example from IRAP who are supporting refugee-led organization, and other organizations who are really uplifting some beautiful examples. I think one question that I wanted to open it to in the chat to everyone is how can civil society and refugee-led organizations and people who are presented in today's webinar better frame resettlement, and where do you see the biggest opportunity for impact? So if you can really start putting things in the chat to reflect about this question, and I want to open it to speakers if you see something in the chat that you would like to respond to or comment about it.
Basma, I can jump in. I'm also seeing a number of people who are refugees here with us today in situations that could be perilous or are extremely challenging, asking what's happening with my case, what's happening with my situation. And I'm seeing this more and more as well as these chats are opened up to a global community. And it's really important to address that. And I don't think anything that we can say here is going to adequately address what your needs are on the ground immediately. But I will say that please, if it relates to Refuge Point, reach out to us in Nairobi about labor mobility. Often with resettlement, many people have resettlement cases that are in the process, but then government political will changes. If you look at the US, it was in the process of bringing many people in, and then the doors shut when the current administration came into office. That happens a lot, but sometimes the information doesn't get communicated back to people, so they're wondering what's happening with my case. And I think we, as a community of organizations and entities responsible for supporting people through these pathways, have a responsibility to try to provide adequate information. With Jackie, when you mentioned that UNHCR has lost so much funding, I mean, it's just worth highlighting the life consequences for that for people on the ground. But it also means that organizations like UNHCR and many others don't have the capacity to respond as quickly as possible to all the questions and about what's happening with individual cases. So please do ask those questions. On our side, we'll do our best to get back to you. Basma, I want to jump in then with one other point, and I'll try to make it briefly because I love listening to Mustafa and Jackie speak here, and these questions are so important. And that is that the High Commissioner has highlighted reducing the number of people by half who are in need of support. Of course, resettlement and complementary pathways can play an important role in that. But we're seeing but that's not the only place where that goal is going to be achieved. And I wanted to highlight for people here that as we talked about, most people are stuck for decades or indefinitely in situations of displacement. We need to find ways to support people to become self-reliant so they can support themselves, contribute to their communities, have a roof over their heads, food on the table, see their kids in school, and try to have as normal a life as possible. And this is actually happening right now. There's a big groundswell movement around promoting self-reliance for people stuck in countries to which they fled. There's an organization that Refuge Point hosts called the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative, which has over 650 partners, including UNHCR and many here, that are promoting self-reliance around the world. And we're seeing people who can stand on their own 2 feet, but we're also seeing the convergence around the idea of self-reliance and the idea of people moving into another country or a legal migration pathway. And that is when people get training and support, it can help them build a normal life where they are, or it could also help them access a legal migration pathway. Just for example, in Nairobi, where Refuge Point has a flagship program to help people become self-reliant, there's a woman from Congo who's a refugee named Ugwa. She's a young woman who is in a very vulnerable situation with her family. She is now in a mechanics program, earning money, and wants to be a mechanic and start up mechanics businesses so that she can hire other people. Thankfully, the Kenyan government has policies that enable her to do this and enable people to start businesses. But she's doing that so she can build as normal a life as possible in Nairobi, but also the skills that she's gaining could help her access some kind of legal migration pathway. And so there's a confluence between the idea of helping people to become self-reliant and helping people access legal migration pathways that's really important, and we've talked about before, and I want to continue highlighting, because no one thing is actually going to help reduce the amount of people who are needing aid. And yet we're going to see over the coming decades more and more people forcibly displaced by war, conflict, and violence, but also climate. And so we have to figure out solutions that match people's needs.
Thank you so
The
much.
only thing
Yeah, and you have some questions in the chat, Mustafa, for you too. We can go over.
One other question that came from Zahra is around basically how can we start doing a little bit more or different advocacy, and then especially with countries like Germany. And here, what I'm offering is just what I think. So I could be wrong, I could be right, but it's just kind of maybe my way of thinking if it comes to advocacy. I feel maybe kind of also Jackie alluded to it a little bit, that we start coming out of our comfort zone. Comfort zone means that we try to connect with groups that usually we don't talk to, and try to accept that the conversation about refugee is not only a conversation of a charity, of weakness, of needs, but how can we basically also talk about the opportunity in this. I remember when I was trying to negotiate in 2018, sorry, the labor pathway. And when I was always entering the room, I was trying to talk to people and tell them, like, don't think of me as a refugee, think of me as an opportunity. And let's talk about me as an opportunity. It was one of the people with me from the government at that point, Canada, was like, and then she was saying, it's like, I've never been able to say this. I've never been able basically to go and then like talk to people and say, let's just think of refugees as opportunity. But when I hear you saying it, that maybe there's a way of me to talk about it. Again, I'm not saying this is the same conversation that you would have with every single person. I think talking to the young people, often I used to do in different countries when I go and then try to have a chat with young in colleges. The first thing I start with, and because I know that they always like challenge, is that I tell people is like, if you convince me, I have some numbers in the back of like with me. And if you convince me that refugees are economically burdened, I'm going to be the first to go out with you and then go on a video and then say is that you should not resettle refugee. And then people would love to start having conversation on this because they want it to bring whatever evidence they have over long term in terms of like whether that would be economic burden or not. So what I'm trying to say is that we need to start thinking of different way, not only out of our comfort zone in the kind of people and the kind of group that we talk to, but also out of our comfort zone in terms of like, what is resettlement? What are the opportunities of resettlement to others? How can we talk about it a little bit differently? And not to neglect that it's still a moral and illegal and still action, but it can't be one message to all the audience. I cannot go and I always kind of say this, I cannot go and pull a picture of a young child in a camp in very devastating situation to a banker who would basically be upset on this picture for 5 minutes, but after that, like, all what he's going to think about is just, funds and resources. Is that going to be physically viable for them or not? And I think this is maybe one of the ways that we need to start talking to the public and to shift our messages and yeah, just a few thoughts on this.
Yes, diversify messengers. Go ahead, Jackie.
Maybe what I'd like to do is to beg for help. Actually, there are now 85 people on this call. Maybe 80 of them were not part of the organizing group. And, we have these conversations all the time. How do we communicate what is important about asylum? How do we communicate how resettlement contributes to, but is not a sufficient substitute for asylum? How do we talk about what it looks like for a refugee to seek a solution anywhere? Sasha's right? Somebody is more and more educated, more and more experienced. They should be able to build a life somewhere. Where are the things that are getting in the way of that, and how do we lift those barriers? That's what I do every day. But I'm not a consumer of UNHCR's output, right? I'm not really even a consumer of Sasha's because I see it every day. It's part of what we do. I think we would love to hear ideas in the last 9 minutes from the group here as to what they're seeing in their community, what they're seeing in media, with the conversations that they're having, the Uber drivers they're talking to, that where you feel like there's a gap. What is the information that's missing? What is the messaging that's missing? Where are we not missing the mark? Where are we not catching the mark? And I think, there's no question that we are at the moment in a crisis. There's no question at all that around the world, people are questioning the very validity of the offer of asylum. We know it saved millions of lives. We know that some 80% of people think it's okay to think it's a good idea to offer protection to people who have to flee violence, who have to be fleeing persecution, fleeing war. And yet an ever decreasing number of people want to use the word refugee. How do we make a gift of a human gift into a dirty word? How did we do that? How did we diminish the value of something we should be proud of? I would like to hear more from you guys in the chat, in the conversation, but going forward in as many fora as we can. And please engage in these dialogues when they start so that we can think together about how to change that narrative and how we can really turn the world around and start being proud again of what we have created as humans, which is a global system that is set up for, and sometimes we fail. I know that we fail. But you know what? Millions of people have benefited from this system that was set up after we failed in 1945. Thanks.
Amen.
Thank you so much, Jackie. The audience, feel free to jump in with ideas in the chat, please. I think even commitments. Who are you going to talk to today and tomorrow and this week and next week about resettlement, and how you can bring them closer to you? I do agree with Mustafa around who are the messengers and how we can really have a message that resonate with different communities depending on their interest and what this this space or this topic can bring back to them. And we have heard in the beginning of the call a lot of the why from Jackie on the impact of resettlement on the refugees, on the communities, on governments, on the economy, and how much really we can be louder in those messages, and how much really we can having more conversations with communities to bring them closer to this work. Also, thank you, Jackie, for sharing your email in the chat with the community. I know we will be sharing the recording, and if there are specific questions in the chat was not answered, we will make sure that this happen in a follow-up. Please continue to have your thoughts, questions, interventions in the chat while we are here. We have 6 minutes left. I wanted really to bring us back to, I know we talked about many different topics, but really wanted to bring it back to the resettlement conversation and how critical and life-saving resettlement is, and how much we really need political will, because we heard it clear. We have community commitments, we have community willingness, we want to have a political will, and we need that through really making sure we have more communities speaking about resettlement and advocating for resettlement, and to bring back the political will into the space. I always reminded by good people and mentors that we have went through this before. And we will overcome this time. I know I started this work since 2010, and I have seen twice so far resettlement shut down in the US, and we were able, after the first time, rebuild it and expand it and became very bold on and creative in how we have done it. So I have, as much as my heart has been broken since last January of 2025, and how programs that we have created and offices of resettlement were open and expanded around the US have been closed or shut down, we are already talking about how we can rebuild it. So really keeping this energy and grounding ourselves that this is the situation we are in is not permanent, and we need to really think about the future and how we can expand by having more conversations around that. So I want to give each speaker maybe a minute or two to ground our community and give them hope, and talk about how critical this conversation is and how we can really take it back to our communities. And after that, we will be closing our session for today. So maybe Sasha, do you want to start?
Sure. Thanks, Basma. And Mustafa, great to be here with you. You're so inspiring. Jackie, you too, for wonderful words. We're missing a really critical voice here, obviously. The government of Spain is not here. And I just wanted to highlight again the role of the government of Spain and other governments. We've highlighted Brazil, but there are many others, Canada too, and as well. And Brian Dick has said some wonderful things here in the chat. He's a real leader in community sponsorship and refugee resettlement in Canada. But governments are so key and critical. The government of Spain is leading the charge in terms of highlighting the value of resettlement and the importance of resettlement. And there are many wonderful examples in Spain of refugees arriving and contributing to their local communities. We have to ensure that as many governments as possible continue to carry that flag, because we're seeing too many that turn away from that, and it's unnecessary. It's really based on politics, but there are communities that can and want to welcome refugees. So we are all here so grateful to the government of Spain, to Brazil, to all the governments that continue to bring people in for resettlement. And you can make a lot of arguments around why resettlement is important. Mustafa highlighted those. They contribute economically. Jackie highlighted how resettlement contributes to global security. The biggest refugee hosting country in the world has turned to UNHCR, as Jackie said, and said, can can you help resettle some refugees? It often doesn't matter the amount as much as the will and the ability to stand up and say, this is important, because that's what influences other governments to act as well. So there's national security value, there's economic value, but for all of us here who are in the choir, I will just double down on the moral importance of doing this. If we look back at our own family histories, if you're not a refugee now, many of us may have been in the past. Mustafa, I loved your point around how the Middle East hosted European refugees after World War II. This is something that relates to all of us, or can, or will, or has. There's a moral obligation we all have to each other as human beings to ensure that people who are in the most life and death situations, the most precarious situations, have access to safety, have access to rebuilding their lives. And it's not difficult to do. We have these programs in the world. We can increase them so that people who might not otherwise survive have a pathway to safety. And I'm just grateful to be here with all of you in this effort together.
Want to go, Mustafa, Jackie?
I'm just trying to think of very short sentences, but maybe what I was able to think of is that when resettlement, I think it's important for us to recognize that when resettlement places are cut, people do not become safer. It's just they become invisible. And we need to remember that. And when refugee-led organizations are excluded, the system does not become neutral. I mean, it just becomes less informed. And I think states like Spain making that kind of a choice, like a choice of states, can always can cut pathway, or they can lead with protection and prove it works. And I think states like Spain, maybe this is an example that we need to highlight more. We need to think about more. We need to talk about it more. Then maybe other states can follow.
Yes, to everything that has just been said. I mean, I think at its most basic, resettlement is the offer on behalf of a community by countries to individuals and to countries of asylum, their peer countries of asylum, to get people on the path to something that is ordinary, right? An ordinary life, and a life that is perhaps invisible in a good way, right? Not just a statistic, but a person who's able to just get on with their day. And I think at that most simple level, for all of the politicization that's happening around asylum in general, resettlement in specific, for all of the barriers that are being put up to the sorts of migration pathways that refugees want to get on to achieve complementary pathways, we are at our base, we are all, maybe not absolutely everybody here, but most of us here will be citizens of a country, and that we can influence then, as citizens of our country, we can influence what the politicians, what the government of our country does on our behalf. And if your country is on your behalf blocking people from gaining protection, if your country is not offering everything it can to human beings who are in need now so that tomorrow they can contribute, then maybe we haven't done our job as citizens. So what can we do as participants in a society to maybe we want to actually get behind the politicians that are in favor of resettlement, but we need to give them a bit of political cover. How do we support the best possible decisions by those who are elected, those who are in charge of our systems, so that opportunities like resettlement and complementary pathways become available, and so that the natural nervousness about bringing in people who come from somewhere else can be overcome by a recognition of the value that it has to us. And I go back to those same people, right? After World War II, 1 million people were resettled in 5 years to 37 countries. We can do better than that today because they were rebuilding after a world war. Let's step it up.
I think there's no better call to action after that. Thank you so much for Sasha, Mustafa, and Jackie for your powerful work and for being here with us today. And we apologize for any technical issue that really hindered David from the government of Spain to be here, but I felt he was here in spirit because we have heard from all of you the role of Spain in today's work with resettlement, and I hope more governments will really learn and step in to support and to start resettlement or expand resettlement. Thank you so much, everyone. We will follow up with the recording and some documents, but for now, I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.